The night Warren Dole came to collect, I was sitting at my kitchen table counting what was left of my life in dollars and weeks. Not poetry. Math, 9 weeks of flour, 6 of salt pork. Firewood enough for maybe 4 if I stopped being generous with the evening fire and started wearing my coat indoors. The note on the property came due on the first Friday of January, and that Friday was 11 days away, and I was short by an amount that felt both specific and impossible the way debts always do. When you've turned them over in your hands so many times, the edges go soft. I had a number written on the corner of the paper. I had crossed it out and written it again twice, as if the writing were the problem. Outside, the storm had been building since mid-morning. I could hear it in the way the wind changed pitch against the north wall, dropping lower, getting serious. Wyoming Territory winters don't warn you twice. My father used to say, the mountains here don't care if you're ready. They come when they come, and you either are or you aren't. Papa had been ready for 30 years. I had been trying to be ready for 2, and some days I was, and some days I sat at a kitchen table in the dark, doing arithmetic that didn't add up, and listening to a storm decide whether or not to kill me. I was not afraid of Warren Dole exactly. That's not quite the right word. I was tired of him in a way that had grown so large, it had started to look like fear from certain angles. He was a patient man. That was the thing about him that nobody talked about, because patience in a banker sounds like a virtue until you're on the other side of it. He had extended Thomas's loan twice without raising his voice. He had come to the funeral and brought a covered dish and said all the right things. He had given me 14 months after Thomas died before he started sending letters, and the letters were always polite, always sorry to trouble you, always understanding of your situation, Mrs. Voss, and every single one of them tightened the rope a 1/4 inch. I was not afraid of Warren Dole. I just didn't know how to stop him. The knock came at 9:30. 3 strikes hard and deliberate. Not the wind, not a branch. Someone's knuckle against my door with intention behind it. I was on my feet before I decided to stand. The rifle came off the wall the way it always does when something changes in the night, which is to say, without much thought, just the body knowing what the mind hasn't caught up to yet. I moved to the side of the door, not in front of it, the way Papa had taught me, and I listened. Nothing for a moment. Then the knock again. Same rhythm. 3 beats, patient waiting. Not Dole's knock. Dole knocked like a man who expected the door to open. This was different. This was the knock of someone who understood they might not be let in. I went to the window first. The glass had fogged at the edges from the cold, and I wiped a circle clear with my sleeve and looked out into the dark and the driving snow. A man stood at my door. That was the first thing. Large, broad through the shoulders, the kind of large that is useful rather than threatening, though I have learned that distinction takes time, and I was not prepared to make it yet. His coat was heavy canvas, stiffened with ice along the collar and sleeves. He was not hunched against the wind the way most men hunch, not curling inward trying to be smaller. He was just standing there, in the storm, waiting. Behind him, barely visible through the snow, a horse stood, with its head dropped low, one hip cocked, in the exhausted way horses go when they have been pushed too far. Even from a distance in the dark, I could see the animal's ribs with each labored breath. I looked at the man's hands, both visible, neither near his belt. I looked at the horse again. No second animal. He was alone. I looked at his face, or what I could see of it, which was not much. The brim of his hat was crusted with snow, and he was looking down at the ground, not at the window, not trying to see me. Just waiting the way you wait when you are cold and tired and out of better options and you know it. I have made a small study of men who come to doors at night out of necessity rather than interest. I have learned to read what they want from how they stand. Most men who want something lean toward the door. Most men who want trouble try not to look like it. Most men who are afraid try to look bigger than they are. This man was not leaning, was not trying to look like anything in particular. He was just standing in the snow, being exactly as cold and tired as he appeared. And something in that ordinariness was what finally moved me. That and the horse. I had a soft spot for horses that had been used past their limit. Thomas used to say I cared more about horses than people, and I used to tell him that horses hadn't given me as many reasons to be cautious. I unlatched the door and opened it with the rifle held at my side, not raised, but present. The man looked up. I have been trying since that night to find the right words for what I saw in his face, and I keep coming back to the same inadequate ones. He was not young, not old. Maybe 35, 36. Wind burned along the cheekbones and jaw. A few days of dark beard going gray at the edges. He had the kind of face that had been weathered by being outdoors and not by being unhappy, though I later came to understand that both had played a part. But it was his eyes that stopped me. I have seen a lot of things in men's eyes. Hunger, want, calculation, fear dressed up as confidence. I have seen the eyes of men who are lying and the eyes of men who are about to ask for something they know they shouldn't have. These eyes were none of that. They were the eyes of a man who had stopped wanting things. Not sad exactly, not angry, just emptied out the way a house looks after someone has moved everything out of it. Still standing, still structured, but nobody home in the way that matters. I recognized something in that look. I did not know standing in my doorway in the cold what it would cost me to recognize it. He spoke before I could. I know I'm a stranger. His voice was low, rougher than expected, like something that hadn't been used much recently. I know you don't have a reason to trust me. I'm not asking to come inside. I just need to stand under your roof until morning. I'll sleep in the barn if you have one. I won't be any trouble. He wasn't begging. He wasn't performing. He was stating facts in the way you state facts when you have run out of everything else and facts are all you have left. I looked past him at the horse. That animal needs to come in out of the cold, I said. She's going to founder if she stands in that much longer. I know it. A pause. I pushed her too hard today. That's on me. Something about the way he said that. Not defensive. Not making excuses. Just acknowledging the fact plainly the way you acknowledge something you're not proud of and have no intention of lying about. I stepped back from the door. Barn's around the east side. Hay's in the loft, you'll see it. There's a water bucket that'll need unfreezing. Come to the door when you're done with the horse. He nodded once. Didn't thank me. Just turned and went back into the storm with his horse, and I closed the door against the cold and stood with my back against it for a moment, listening to myself breathe. I had just let a stranger into my barn in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard. Thomas would have done the same thing without thinking twice. That was one of the things I had loved about him, and one of the things that had gotten him into trouble more than once. I was not Thomas. I was the one who thought twice, usually 3 times. But I had opened the door anyway, and standing there with my back against it, I tried to decide if I had done something foolish or something right, and I couldn't quite tell the difference yet. I put the rifle back on the wall. Then I took it down again and leaned it against the table where I could reach it. Then I put water on to heat and started cutting what was left of the salt pork into the pot. When he knocked again 20 minutes later, he had brushed most of the snow off himself before coming to the door. His boots had been knocked clean on the step. He came inside when I moved back, and he stopped just inside the threshold and looked at the space with the careful eyes of someone making sure he understands where he is. The cabin was not much. 2 rooms, the bedroom closed off this front room with the table and the fireplace and the iron stove and the shelves Papa had built the first winter we were here. It was clean because I kept it clean the way my mother had taught me in the years before she left, and some of what she'd taught me had already started to fade. It was warm because I had fed the fire, and the warmth after the cold outside made the room feel smaller and the man feel larger. He stood just inside the door and waited. Sit down, I said, nodding at the chair nearest the fire. He sat, pulled off his hat, held it in both hands. His hair was dark and damp and pressed flat against his head. He set the hat on his knee and looked at the fire. On the table before he sat, he had placed something. A pocket watch. Brass, by the look of it. Old, but cared for the case, worn smooth along the edges from years of handling. He set it down without ceremony, without drawing attention to it, just cleared a place among my papers, and set it there, as if finding it a home for the night. I did not ask about it, but I looked at it. The hands were stopped. I could not see the exact time from where I stood, but the hands were clearly stopped, not moving. A watch that wasn't running. He had set a broken watch on my table the way you set down something precious, not something broken. I brought 2 bowls of the soup and set one in front of him without asking if he wanted it. He looked at the bowl. Then he ate. Not quickly, not like a man who hadn't eaten. Steadily. A few spoonfuls, then he stopped and looked at the fire again. I ate across the table from him, and we did not speak for a while. Outside, the storm had gotten louder. The north wall was taking the worst of it, groaning at the joins every now and then, in a way I knew meant it would hold, but wanted me to know it was working at it. "Thank you," he said when the bowl was half empty. "For the horse, and for this." "The horse needed it," I said. He nodded, accepting the correction without complaint. Later, I would think about that. Most men, when you redirect a thank you, push back a little, insist on the gratitude. He just accepted it and went back to eating, and that small thing told me something I couldn't have named precisely, but that I filed away. When he was done, he set the spoon in the bowl and folded his hands on the table and looked at me directly for the first time. Not aggressively, not with anything particular. Just looked the way someone looks when they've decided to stop pretending they aren't in the same room as another person. "My name is Ridge Calloway," he said. "Clara Voss," I said. "I'll be gone by first light if the storm breaks. If it doesn't, I'll be out of your way as much as I can manage. I don't need much." "There's a blanket roll in the chest by the wall," I said. "The floor near the hearth is warmer than it looks." He got up and found the blankets without needing me to show him. He settled on the floor the way people settle when they're used to sleeping on floors efficiently, without complaint. His hat went over his face. His coat stayed on. The watch stayed on the table. I washed the bowls and damped down the fire for the night, and went to my room and lay on my bed and looked at the ceiling. Through the wall, I could hear the storm and nothing else. He made no sound at all. I lay there thinking about the watch. Not because there was anything particularly strange about a broken watch, but because of the way he had placed it, with both hands, setting it down the way you set down something you carry carefully. I thought about what he had said. "I don't need much." Not, "I won't need much." Not, "I'll try not to need much." "I don't need much." As if needing things was something he'd already stopped doing. I thought about that for a long time. Long enough that the storm outside had gone from screaming to moaning, settling into the lower register it takes on when it decides to stay. And somewhere in that settling, I fell asleep, though I hadn't meant to, and I did not dream, which was a relief. In the morning, I thought. In the morning, I would figure out what to do with him. But the night wasn't finished with me yet. Somewhere around midnight, I woke to something I couldn't immediately place. Not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of a sound I'd been expecting. The storm had quieted, a degree dropped from a moan to a whisper, and in that new quiet, I could hear something I hadn't been able to hear before. The fire had burned low. The room beyond my door was dim and orange. I lay still and listened. He was talking, barely above a whisper. I couldn't hear the words through the door, just the rhythm of them low and unsteady. The way people speak when they are talking to someone who cannot answer. I had done it myself. I had stood at Thomas's grave in October, when the ground was still soft enough to receive me without ice, and told him about the harvest and the price of salt and the fact that the Wilson family's oldest boy had offered to help with the fence, and I had said no because I didn't know how to say yes to anything yet. You talk to the ones who aren't there anymore, when the ones who are there can't hear you. I lay very still and did not move and let him have that. After a while, the talking stopped. I closed my eyes and did not sleep again until nearly dawn, and in the thin gray time between waking and sleeping, I found myself thinking about the watch on the table. The hands stopped somewhere in the night, frozen at a time that meant something to someone, and the man on my floor talking quietly to no one, and the horse in my barn that had been pushed too hard, and outside the storm going quiet, just quiet, as if the mountain had heard enough for one evening and decided to give us all a rest. When I finally slept, my last thought was not about Warren Dole, or the money, or the 11 days. My last thought was, What time does that watch say? He had the fire rebuilt before I woke up. That was the first thing. I came out of the bedroom at first gray light, expecting a cold room and a man who might or might not still be there. And instead, the fire was going strong, and the cabin was warm, and he was sitting outside on the front step in the snow with a cup of coffee looking at the mountains. I stood in the doorway to the front room for a moment and looked at the rebuilt fire. He had laid the wood the way my father used to lay it, the larger pieces crossed at the back, and the smaller pieces nested in front, where the flame could reach them easily. Not the way I laid it, which was Thomas's way, which was perfectly functional, but different. This was my father's way, and I had not seen anyone build a fire this way in 2 years, and it hit me somewhere I wasn't ready for it. I went to the window and looked at him sitting on the step. He was not looking at anything in particular that I could see. Just the mountains, which were still half lost in low cloud from the storm, but beginning to show their ridgelines as the light came up. He held the coffee cup in both hands the way you hold something warm when you need to feel something warm, and he was completely still in the way that I was learning was simply how he existed when nothing required him to move. I made my own coffee and went to the door. "Storm's not done," I said. "No," he said, "but it's thinking about it." I looked at the sky. He was right. There was a color in the east that meant the worst of it had passed, even if the cold hadn't. I stood in the doorway because going outside felt like a commitment I hadn't made yet. "You slept on the floor?" I said. "I've slept in worse places." "That's not what I meant." He looked up at me then, waiting. "I meant there's a cot in the barn. Would have been warmer. Barn was warm enough for the horse," he said. "Figured I'd leave her to it." I went back inside and started on breakfast, which was cornmeal mush and the last of the salt pork cut thin, and after a while, he came in from the step without being asked and sat at the table, and I put a plate in front of him, and we ate again without talking, which by the second morning had stopped feeling like something that needed to be filled. After breakfast, he stood and started clearing the dishes before I could reach them. "You don't need to do that," I said. "I know it." He kept clearing. I watched him for a moment. His movements in my kitchen were careful, the way someone is careful in a space that isn't theirs. Not awkward, but deliberate, making sure not to rearrange anything, not to presume. "The fence on the northeast corner blew down in the night," I said. "I saw it from the window, and the chugging pipe to the barn water trough ices up every hard freeze. It'll need to be thawed before the horse can drink properly." He turned from the dishes. "All right. The roof on the chugging house is also pulling away from the north wall. Hasn't been right since October, and I'm low on split wood. The rounds are cut, but not split, they're around the side." I was listing these things in the tone of someone stating what needs doing, not asking for help. He seemed to understand that. He nodded at each item with the same attention, not more for the difficult ones, not less for the simple ones. "I can do all of that," he said, "if you'll let me stay until the trail clears." 3 days, I said. "Maybe 4, if it freezes hard again tonight." 3 days, he said. "I'll earn it." He went out, and I stood at the window and watched him go to work. He found the woodpile without being told where it was, which meant he had looked around the property when he was putting the horse away. I noted that without judgment. It was what a cautious person does. You learn the shape of a place before you settle into it. He split wood with the economy of a man who has split a great deal of wood and stopped finding any drama in it. No wasted motion. The axe came up and came down, and the wood came apart, and he moved to the next piece. I timed it absently while I was making bread. One rhythm, consistent, unhurried. He didn't rest much. He didn't look at the house. Hattie Morse came up the mountain at mid-morning. This was not unusual. Hattie had been making improbable trips up to my place ever since Thomas died in weather that would have kept most people with more sense indoors. She was 58 years old and had been running her store in town for 20 of those years alone since her husband, Morris, died of a fever that the doctor said would pass and then didn't, and she had developed opinions about what women could and could not manage on their own that she felt it was her civic duty to share with me regularly. She came through the door with snow on her coat and the particular expression she wore when she had noticed something that required discussing. "You have a man splitting wood in your yard," she said. "I know it," I said. "I told him to." Hattie went to the window and looked out at Ridge in the way that Hattie looked at most things, which was thorough and unhurried. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His hands are interesting." His hands. The way they're calloused. Most woodsmen, the calluses run along the palm and the base of the fingers from the axe handle. His run along the side of the index finger and the inside of the thumb. She paused. Like someone who holds a pen a great deal. Or used to. I had not noticed his hands specifically. I found that I was annoyed with myself for not noticing. "He's stopping here because of the storm," I said. "Doing some work in exchange. He'll be gone when the trail clears." Hattie continued looking out the window. "Where's he come from?" "He didn't say, and I didn't ask." She turned from the window and looked at me with the expression that meant she had something to say that she wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "Dole was in the store yesterday afternoon, asking about things." "What things?" "You. The property. Whether anyone had been up the mountain recently. Whether you'd had any visitors." She paused. "Whether you might be in the market for a quick sale if the right offer came along." The bread dough in my hands had gone still without my noticing. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were the most stubborn woman in Creston County and that the mountain would fall into the earth before you sold a square foot of what your papa built." She came to sit at my table with the ease of someone who has sat there many times. "But Clara, he's preparing something. I can feel it the way you feel weather." I knew she was right. I had been feeling it too, the same way I felt the storm coming yesterday in the way the air changes before something arrives. "I know," I said. "Do you have any idea what the contract actually says?" "The one Thomas signed?" I was quiet for a moment. "Thomas signed it," I said. "He didn't ask me to look at it." Hattie's expression did not change, but her silence had a texture to it. "He wanted to handle it himself," I said, and I heard the flatness in my own voice, the particular flatness that comes from having said something too many times. "He didn't want me to worry." "No," Hattie said carefully. "I'm sure he didn't." We sat with that for a moment. "I have something I should tell you," Hattie said. She reached into her coat pocket and I expected some piece of mail she had been carrying up for me, but what she brought out was a small book cloth-covered worn at the corners. "You know Edna Pierce lost her place last spring." "I know it. Ed's husband signed a contract with Dole 6 years ago, when they needed a loan to expand the herd. Edna sat with me one evening last fall and told me every detail of it, what Dole had told her husband, what the contract said, how the thing had worked to take the land out from under them. I wrote it down." She set the book on my table. "I didn't know what I'd do with it. I just didn't want to forget. I've written down a few others since." I looked at the book. "A few others. 9 families in 8 years, Clara, all in this county, all with contracts that had a particular kind of language in them." Her voice was steady and factual, the way Hattie always was when she was most serious. The kind of language that sounds like protection, but isn't. I looked at the book on my table. Then I looked out the window at Ridge splitting wood in my yard. I picked up the book and turned it over in my hands. "Can I read this?" "That's why I brought it," she said. She left an hour later, back down the mountain, into weather that would have deterred most people half her age. I stood at the window and watched her go, and then looked out at Ridge, who had moved on to the fence line and was working with a methodical patience that I was beginning to recognize as simply his manner. He came in at midday, cold through, and washed his hands at the basin without being shown where it was. I had soup on, and I put it on the table, and we sat again. I had Hattie's book on the chair beside me. I was thinking about it, not about him, and so I was not particularly careful about what I left where, and the papers I'd pushed aside to make room for the soup bowls included the bank correspondence I had been looking at the night before. He reached past me to move his bowl to a clearer spot, and his eyes went across the papers, and I felt the moment his attention changed. It was subtle. He did not stop moving. He did not point or comment. He just looked for perhaps 2 seconds, the way you look when you pass something you recognize. And then he looked away and picked up his spoon. But I had been watching him in the way I had been watching him since he arrived, which was the way you watch something you don't yet understand, and I saw it. I gathered the papers and set them to the side without comment. He did not look at them again. We ate. After a while, he said without looking up from his bowl, "How long have you been managing this place alone?" 2 years, I said. He nodded, did not say anything sympathetic, did not say anything at all, just received the information and sat with it, which I found I preferred to the condolences that people still occasionally produce 2 years on, as if grief had a fixed expiration date, and it should surprise me when it didn't. "Before that," he said carefully, "it was your husband, and before him my father. He built this place. He died 3 winters ago." He nodded again. "You," I said. It was not a gracious question, but he had asked, and it seemed fair. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My wife passed 16 months ago. We had a place outside Cheyenne." He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to. The 16 months was precise in a way that told me he had counted them, was still counting them, the way you count things that you are not ready to stop measuring. "You left Cheyenne," I said. Not a question. "I left," he said. Just that. The watch was on the table between us. I had been aware of it all through lunch, the way you are aware of something in a room that you keep deciding not to look at. In the afternoon light, I could see the hands clearly now. 11:47. I looked at it for a moment, and then I looked at him, and something in my face must have asked the question, because he said without me speaking, "She gave it to me when we found out the baby was coming." He looked at the watch, not at me. "She died at 11:47 at night. The baby didn't make it either." The room was very quiet. I had children died before. I had buried a child. I had seen what that does to a person, and it is not like other losses. It is a specific kind of loss that takes something out of the architecture of a person, something load-bearing, and afterward they are still standing, but differently than before. "I haven't wound it since," he said. "I don't know what I'm waiting for." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, because it was the truest thing I had available. Thomas used to hum when he was working, the same few bars over and over, a thing he'd made up himself. I heard someone humming it in the feed store in October, and I turned around before I could stop myself. I paused. There's no logic to it, what we carry. He looked up from the watch and met my eyes for the first time that day. Not with gratitude exactly, with recognition. The look of someone who has been speaking a language alone for a long time and has just heard it spoken back. He didn't say anything. I didn't need him to. That evening, I sat with Hattie's book after supper and read, while Ridge sat near the fire, working at something with his hands, a length of harness leather that had cracked and needed attention. I read the accounts Hattie had written in her careful schoolroom hand, and the more I read, the heavier the book got in my hands, not physically, but in the other way that things get heavy when they are full of real weight. 9 families, 8 years, all with the same pattern. A loan extended reasonably, repaid reasonably for a time, and then a trigger always buried in the middle of the contract, language always written to look like standard terms that allowed the whole thing to tip in Dole's direction at a moment of his choosing. I thought about Thomas sitting across from Warren Dole in that office in town, signing his name to something he thought he understood. Thomas, who was good and honest and trusted people to be the same. Thomas, who had not asked me to look at it because he wanted to handle it himself, and he'd thought he had. I sat with that for a while. The anger at Thomas and the grief for Thomas sitting together in my chest, the way they had learned to sit, neither one winning. I looked up from the book. Ridge had set the harness leather aside and was looking at the fire. He was still in that way he had, but his hand was resting near the watch on the table, not touching it, just near it, the way you stay close to things you're not ready to put away. I went back to reading. Late in the evening, when I was nearly done with the book and the fire had gone to coals, I set it down and said without planning to, "The contract Thomas signed. Do you know what language that kind of contract usually uses? The kind that looks like standard terms but isn't? There was a pause. I might, he said, carefully. How might you know that? Another pause longer. He turned the watch over in his hand, once slowly. Before, he said, before things changed. I worked with contracts, land and property mostly. I read a great many of them. Some of them were straightforward, and some of them were not. And after a while, you learn to see the difference. A lawyer, I said. A legal clerk, he said. And a land agent. I was never called to the bar. He paused. But I know what the language looks like. I put Hattie's book on the table and looked at him across it. Would you be willing to look at the contract Thomas signed? He looked at the book, then at me. Yes, he said. I would. I went to the chest where I kept the papers and brought out the contract folded and creased from being handled. I set it on the table between us, and he picked it up and started reading, and I watched his face. He was very still while he read. I noticed it again, the quality of his stillness, the way it was not emptiness, but attention gathered inward. He read it twice. I knew he was reading it twice because his eyes tracked back to the top and started again. Then he set it flat on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he pressed one finger to a paragraph near the middle of the second page. There, he said. I leaned forward. That clause says that in the event of any payment made more than 1 day past the due date, the lender has the right to pursue immediate remedy without additional notice. Immediate remedy means he can move to take the property. He looked up at me. But a clause like this written into a contract without being separately disclosed and explained to the borrower runs against what common law holds about fair dealing. If it was never explained to your husband, if Dole never sat across from him and said, "This is what this means," then it's not enforceable. Not if you raise it in front of a justice of the peace who knows his business. I looked at the clause. I had read this contract before. I had read it in the days after Thomas died, trying to understand what we owed and when, and I had not understood that particular section as anything other than standard language, because it sounded like standard language. It was designed to sound that way. Would you be willing to help me raise it? I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then at the contract. Yes, he said. The same word as before, the same plainness. Tell me when Dole is supposed to come. Friday, I said. 11 days. He nodded. Then we have time to do this properly. I sat across from him in the lamplight with the contract between us and Hattie's book beside it, and the fire going to ash in the hearth, and the storm finished outside, finally the way storms finish in Wyoming in the deepest part of winter. Not gradually, but all at once, leaving behind a silence so complete, it's almost loud. I thought about Hattie's words from that morning. He's preparing something. I thought about Thomas sitting across from Warren Dole trusting. I thought about the watch on the table stopped at 11:47, and the man sitting across from me, who hadn't wound it yet, who was waiting for something he couldn't name. And something that had been pulled very tight in my chest for 2 years shifted just slightly the way a knot shifts when you find the right end of it. Not loosened, just found. Before I went to bed, I stopped at the window and looked out at the mountain under the cleared sky. The stars hard and bright, the way they only get after a Wyoming storm, scrubs everything clean, and I stood there for a moment thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Then I went to my room. The watch was still on the table. I noticed before I closed my door that I had stopped trying to read the time on it. I already knew what time it said. What I didn't know yet was what time it would say when it started running again, or if it would, or if I would be the reason it did. The third morning arrived without drama. That was the thing about Wyoming Territory winters that people who had never lived through one did not understand. The violence was not constant. Between the storms, there were these stretches of stillness so complete they felt almost apologetic, the sky going a hard, clean blue, and the snow on the ground turning brilliant in the sunlight, and everything so quiet you could hear the creak of your own boots on the porch boards from 30 yards away. The mountain offered you these intervals, not as gifts, but as reminders. This is what it could be, the stillness said. Remember this when the next one comes. I came out of my bedroom at first light and found the fire already built and Ridge already gone. Not gone from the property, gone from the cabin. I could see him through the east window out past the woodpile, crouching at the base of the fence line he had repaired yesterday, examining something in the post he had set, checking his own work, making sure it had held through the overnight freeze. I stood at the window with my hands around my coffee cup and watched him for a moment. He had been out there long enough that his breath was visible in the cold air, small clouds appearing and disappearing with each exhale steady and unhurried. He was not checking the post the way a man checks something he hopes is fine. He was checking it the way a man checks something he intends to be responsible for. There is a difference, and I had learned to see it. My father had been that way about every fence post on this property. It was one of the first things I had noticed about Thomas too, in different work, in different circumstances, and I did not examine too closely why I was thinking about it now. I turned from the window and started the cornmeal. He came in when I called, though I hadn't called loudly. He must have been watching for the smoke to change in the chimney or some other signal I wasn't aware of giving. He took off his coat and hat and hung them on the peg by the door without being shown where the pegs were. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat at the table. We had developed a routine in 3 days that felt older than 3 days. I did not know what to make of that. After breakfast, he said, "The chugging pipe cleared overnight. Freeze wasn't as hard as it looked." "Good," I said. "I want to look at the roof joint on the north side this afternoon, the one pulling away." "All right." "And I thought," he said, and then stopped. I waited. "There's a good hour before the cold gets serious," he said. "If you wanted to walk the fence line, see what I did on the northeast corner. Make sure it's what you wanted." I looked at him. This was not a man who made suggestions casually. He had been here 3 days, and this was the first time he had proposed anything that wasn't directly practical. "All right," I said again. We went out after breakfast into the hard, bright cold and walked the fence line together for the first time. I had walked it alone hundreds of times in every season, checking for winter damage and summer wear, and I knew every post and every length of wire the way you know the rooms of your own house. Walking it with another person beside me was strange, in a way I had not anticipated. Not unpleasant, just strange. He didn't talk much while we walked. He pointed out things he had done, a brace he had added to a leaning post, a tension adjustment on a wire run that had gone slack, and I looked at each thing and understood it and nodded. At the northeast corner, where the fence had come down in the storm, he had rebuilt it with an extra post driven at an angle into the frozen ground as a dead man anchor. "That'll hold better in the wind," I said. "Should," he said. "Wind comes from that direction up here most of the time. You can see it in the wear on the posts." I looked at the weathering on the old posts. He was right. The northwest faces were scoured, and the southeast faces were relatively fresh. He had read the property in a few days the way I had learned to read it in years. "You've lived in places like this before," I said. It wasn't quite a question. "Different places," he said. "Same kind of country." We came around the back of the property to the place where the mountain started in earnest, where my father's cleared land gave way to the slope, and we stopped there because there was nowhere further to go, and because the view from this spot was what it always was, which was the whole of the valley laid out below us under the winter sun. The town just visible at the far end of it, small and certain a cluster of buildings that proved people had decided to stay. We stood there for a little while without speaking. This was the moment I had been both moving toward and moving away from all morning, without knowing it until I was in it. There are conversations that happen in words, and conversations that happen in proximity, in the fact of two people standing at the same elevation, looking at the same thing at the same time. This was the second kind. We stood at the back edge of my father's land and looked at the valley below. The town at the far end of it was small enough from here that it looked manageable the way problems look manageable from a sufficient distance. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing that needed saying yet, and we had both apparently arrived at the same understanding of that without discussing it. Then he said, not looking at me, looking at the valley. "She laughed at everything." I waited. Annie. She laughed at things that weren't funny. Not because she wasn't serious, she was serious when it mattered, but she found things funny that other people didn't notice. He paused. She would have found something funny about a man sleeping on a stranger's floor in a blizzard and pretending it was a business arrangement. I looked at the side of his face. He was not smiling, but there was something in his expression that was adjacent to smiling, that had the memory of smiling in it. What would she have said? I said. He was quiet for a moment. She would have said, Calloway, you have found yourself a situation, and then she would have laughed, and then she would have told me to stop standing around being dignified about it and do something useful. He stopped. She was right about most things. I looked back at the valley. Thomas was not funny, I said. He tried sometimes. It didn't always work, but he tried earnestly enough that it became funny on its own, the trying itself. I paused. I missed the trying. Ridge turned his head and looked at me. I was not looking at him. I was looking at the valley. But I knew he was looking at me, and I led him the way you let the cold air touch your face when you've been inside too long, because it is uncomfortable, but it is also real. The watch, I said after a moment. Yes, he said, not asking what about it, just acknowledging it was there between us the same way it was there on the table every time we sat down. You said you didn't know what you were waiting for. I said that. Do you know yet? A long pause. The wind moved across the ridge above us, a sound like the mountain breathing, and then was still again. No, he said, but I think I'm closer to knowing than I was 4 days ago. I looked at him then. He was looking at the valley again, not at me, which made it easier to look at him. His face, in the clear winter light, was older than I had first thought, or maybe just more honestly its own age, the kind of face that has been through enough that it has stopped pretending to be younger than it is. Tell me about Cheyenne, I said. He was quiet long enough that I thought he would redirect the question the way he redirected most personal things, with a short answer that closed the door politely. But instead he said, What do you want to know? How you ended up walking away from a place. He looked at his hands for a moment. I did legal work. Land contracts, property transfers, disputes. I'd been doing it for 8 years when Annie died. Knew the work well. Knew the office, knew the clients. He paused. The morning after she died, I went to the office and sat at my desk for 6 hours and could not pick up a pen. Not because I was grief-stricken, though I was, but because I looked at that desk and I could not find a single reason why anything on it mattered. I listened. I came back the next day. Same thing. The day after that, I didn't go. I went out of town instead, just riding, and I kept riding. And I came back 3 days later, and I went back to the office, and I thought this time it will be different. This time, I'll sit down, and the work will make sense again. He stopped. It didn't. When did you leave for good? 2 months after she passed. I settled what I could settle. I left what I couldn't. He looked at the valley. I've been moving since. 8 months, roughly. Working where I can find work. Moving when I can't. Toward anything? Away from things, he said. For a while. I think I've run out of things to be away from. The wind came across the ridge again. I pulled my coat tighter. My mother left when I was 12, I said. Not died, left. Just left one morning and didn't come back. Papa never explained it, and I never asked, because by the time I was old enough to want the answer, I was also old enough to understand that some answers cost more than the question is worth. I paused. I learned very early to manage things myself, to not count on people staying. I did not know why I was saying this, except that he had said his true things and the air between us seemed to require mine. That's a hard thing to learn at 12, he said. It's a useful thing, I said. Mostly. He looked at me. Mostly. It makes it difficult, I said carefully, to let people help, even when you need it. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone who recognizes a landscape he has crossed from a different direction. I know that particular difficulty, he said. From the other side of it, it's hard to help someone who won't let you. and it's hard to ask for help when you've spent a long time telling yourself you don't need it. We stood there at the back edge of my father's land and looked at the valley below, and I thought about the contract on my table and Hattie's book of names and Warren Dole, who was patient in the way that certain slow-moving things are patient, and I thought about Ridge, who had arrived 4 days ago with a stopped watch and an exhausted horse and not enough words, and I thought about Thomas, who had signed a piece of paper because he trusted people, and I thought about my father, who had built everything I was standing on with his own hands over 30 years, stone by stone and post by post. And I thought about what it meant that all of it could be taken by a paragraph buried in the middle of a legal document that was written to be misunderstood. "I'm not very good at this," I said finally. Ridge looked at me. "At any of this," I said. "At having someone here. At talking about the things that matter. I've been alone long enough that I've gotten comfortable with it, and comfortable with alone is not the same as good with alone. It just means you've stopped noticing." He was quiet for a moment. "You're better at it than you think," he said, "from where I'm standing." I looked at him. "You let me in," he said simply. "In a blizzard. That's not nothing." I turned and started walking back toward the cabin because I did not know what to do with what he had just said, except walk away from it temporarily and let it settle somewhere it could be examined later. He fell into step beside me without comment. That afternoon, Hattie came again. I saw her from the window, making her way up the trail on her bay mare, with the particular determination she brought to any journey she had decided to make, regardless of conditions. Ridge was on the roof, checking the join on the north wall. I went out to meet her. She dismounted and handed me the reins without ceremony and looked up at the roof where Ridge was working. "He's still here," she said. "The trail's still frozen hard," I said. "Give it another day." Hattie looked at Ridge in the assessing way she looked at things she was deciding about. He had not seen her yet. He was focused on the roofline, running his hand along the join, where the north wall met the roof slope, testing the soundness of it. "He works like a man trying to outrun something," Hattie said quietly. "He lost his wife," I said. "And a child, 16 months ago." Hattie was silent for a moment. Then she said, "I know something about that kind of running." She tied her mare to the post and came inside with me without being invited, which was her custom, and which I had long since stopped expecting her to change. Inside, she took off her coat and sat, and I put water on, and she set her hands flat on the table in the way she did when she had something to say that she was organizing carefully. "Dole was in the store again this morning," she said. I sat down across from her. "He asked me if I'd had occasion to go up the mountain recently. I told him I hadn't." She paused. "That was a lie, but I'm at the age where I've made my peace with lying to men who deserve it. He also asked about whether I'd heard anything about a man named Calloway." I went very still. "He knew the name," Hattie said. "He knew it before I said anything. He didn't ask who is the stranger at Clara Voss's place. He asked specifically about a man named Calloway." I looked at the table. "I told him I hadn't heard the name," Hattie said. "Which was true at the time since you hadn't told me." "How would Dole know his name?" I said. It was not really a question. It was me thinking aloud. "That," Hattie said, "is what I would like very much to understand." We heard Ridge's boots on the porch, and then he came in, and the change in the room when he entered was the kind of change a room makes when someone takes up space in it, the way he took up space, not aggressively, but undeniably. He looked at Hattie, and she looked at him, and there was a moment of mutual assessment that reminded me of 2 experienced card players sitting down at the same table. "Hattie Morse," I said. "She runs the general store in town. She's been a friend to me since Thomas died." "Ridge Calloway," he said, and crossed to shake her hand. Hattie shook it and held it a moment longer than necessary, and I knew she was doing what she had said she was doing outside, reading his calluses, feeling what his hands told her about who he was. She released his hand, and he sat at the table, and I poured coffee for all 3 of us. "Warren Dole was asking about you this morning," Hattie said. She was not a woman who believed in approaching things indirectly. Ridge's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted just slightly the way water shifts in a still bucket when something disturbs the surface at a distance. "By name," Hattie said. "Yes," Ridge said. He looked at his coffee. He would know the name. I looked at him. How would he know it? Ridge turned the coffee cup once in his hands. Then he set it down and looked at us both, first Hattie, then me, with the expression of a man deciding how much of a thing to say. There was a mining company, he said, outside Laramie. They had a shaft called the Creston. The air in the room changed. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say when they mean something general, that the atmosphere shifted, that the mood altered. What I mean is specific. There was air in the room before he said Creston Shaft, and there was different air in the room after he said it. And in between those two things, there was the fact of Thomas coming home from work on his last day. Thomas, who hummed without knowing he was humming. Thomas, who had gone to work at Creston Shaft because the mule work had dried up and they were hiring and the pay was enough. Go on, I said. My voice came out flat and even, which was what it did when I needed it to be something other than what I was feeling. Ridge looked at me carefully. You know it, he said. It was not a question. Thomas worked there, I said, before the accident. A silence settled over the table. Hattie had gone very still. Ridge looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Something complicated moving through it, and I watched him, and waited, and let the silence do what silence does when it is the only honest thing available. I know, he said. You know, I said. I was brought in to look at their safety practices 18 months ago. I was doing contract work at the time, reviewing workplace agreements, liability documents. What I found was not a safety violation in the paperwork. What I found was that there were no safety practices at all. The paperwork said one thing. What was happening underground said another. He paused. I filed a claim against them, on behalf of the families of the men who had already died. 14 families before Thomas. The room was very quiet. I sat with what he had said and let it arrange itself in my mind the way you let things arrange themselves when you need to understand them correctly and not just quickly. The company closed, I said. Yes. After you filed the claim. The claim forced an inspection. The inspection found conditions that could not be defended. The company could not survive the liability. He stopped. I know what you're thinking. Do you? You're thinking that if the company had stayed open, Thomas would still have had work. And if he'd had work, he might not have taken the job at the shaft that day. And if he hadn't been at the shaft that day. I'm thinking, I said carefully, a great many things at once. Hattie had her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and was looking at the table and saying nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. The company was killing men, Ridge said. 14 before Thomas. The conditions that killed Thomas were the same conditions that killed the other 14. I did not create those conditions. I tried to stop them. He looked at me directly. I know that doesn't change what happened. I know it doesn't give Thomas back. I'm not offering it as comfort. I'm offering it as the truth. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about Thomas signing a contract he didn't read carefully because he trusted the man across the desk from him. I thought about 14 families. I thought about the contract on my table with its buried paragraph, the same buried paragraph in Hattie's book, across 9 different families, over 8 years, the same architecture of language designed to look like one thing and be another. I thought about men who build things that way, systems designed to appear fair while being the opposite, and the distance between them, and the men who go underground trusting the timbers to hold. I thought about Thomas, who hummed without knowing he was humming. Did Dole have a connection to the mining company? I said. Ridge looked at me steadily. He sat on the board of the company that held the original lease on the land, a silent position, nothing documented in any way that would be easy to find. He paused. But he would know my name. He would know what I did. And when he found out you were here, I said, he would want to understand why. Hattie set her coffee cup down with a sound that was not loud but was deliberate. We both looked at her. So, she said in the tone she used when she was summarizing a situation in her store at the end of a long day. We have a man who has been taking land from people in this county for 8 years with a contract clause that shouldn't hold up to examination, and we have the one person in this territory who is actually qualified to examine it sitting at Clara's kitchen table. She looked at Ridge. And Dole knows you're here. It appears so, Ridge said. How much time do we have before he moves? He'll want to move before I can prepare anything, Ridge said. He'll want to file before Friday if he can. That's 4 days, Hattie said. Yes, Hattie looked at me. I have the book. I know, I said. 9 families, she said. 9 sets of documentation. If a justice of the peace were to see all of it together, not just your contract, but the pattern across all of them. It would be harder to dismiss, Ridge said. He was leaning forward slightly now, the stillness in him having given way to something more focused. A single complaint from a widow is one thing. 9 documented instances of the same contractual mechanism used the same way across multiple properties over 8 years is a different thing entirely. Justice of the Peace Harmon, Hattie said. He's a fair man. He's bought his flour from me for 15 years. He does not like Warren Dole, though he's careful about who he says that to. Ridge looked at her. Would he hear it? If it was presented properly, Hattie said, with documentation. She looked at Ridge. Could you present it properly? He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. Yes, he said, if you want me to. I sat at my kitchen table with the contract I had not been able to understand, and Hattie's book of 9 names, and a man who had arrived 4 days ago in a blizzard with a stopped watch, and more history with my life than I had known. And I looked at all of it, the papers, the book, his face, and I thought about my father, who had given 30 years to this land, and Thomas, who had tried to protect it in his way, and I thought about what it would mean to lose it to a buried paragraph. Yes, I said, I want you to. Hattie stood up. Then we have work to do, she said in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for someone to say the right thing for a while now and is relieved they've finally gotten there. I did not sleep well that night. Not because of fear exactly. Fear would have been simpler. What I had was something more tangled, a collection of things I was still sorting, and they did not cooperate with sleep. I lay in my room and listened to the cabin settle in the cold and thought about Ridge sitting on the other side of my wall with his stopped watch and his 16 months of counting and the name Creston Shaft between us, now like a piece of furniture that had appeared in the room without either of us carrying it in. I thought about whether I was angry with him. I tested the word the way you test ice, setting your weight on it carefully to see if it holds. Angry at Ridge Calloway for filing a claim that forced the closure of a company that was killing men underground. Angry at him for doing the thing that was right. The ice didn't hold. I stepped back. What I felt was more honest than anger, and less comfortable. I felt the particular vertigo of learning that the events of your life, which you have arranged into a certain story with certain causes and certain meanings, were also part of another story that you didn't know existed, running parallel. Touching yours at the point that changed everything, but belonging to someone else entirely. Thomas's death had causes I had understood. The company's negligence, the conditions underground, the fact that men were sent into unsafe spaces because the cost of making them safe was inconvenient. I had understood those causes, and they had made the grief coherent, if not bearable. Now there was a name and a face attached to the chain of events, and the name and the face belonged to a man who had done the right thing, and I had to find a place to put that. I found it eventually in the small hours of the morning. It was the same place I had put a lot of things since Thomas died, the mental equivalent of a chest in a corner, where you keep things that are true and important, and that you cannot resolve, and that you have decided to live alongside, rather than understand completely. I put it there. I closed the lid. I went to sleep. In the morning, Ridge was on the floor by the fire, with the stopped watch in his hand, and his eyes open looking at the ceiling. I came out of the bedroom, and he turned his head and looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything about the night before, which was a kind of courtesy I was beginning to understand was how he operated. He did not push at things. He let them be where they were. I made coffee, and we sat at the table, and he had the contract out already, and Hattie's book, and he had a piece of paper where he had been writing a list of notes in a hand that was clear and precise, nothing wasted. 9 instances, he said when I set his cup in front of him. All with the same core clause, slightly reworded each time, but functionally identical. All in properties within 15 miles of the railway survey route. I sat down. He knew the railway was coming. He would have known years before the survey was published. That kind of information moves through certain circles. Ridge looked at his notes. He's been positioning himself to hold the land the railway needs to cross. Force favorable terms from the company or sell at a premium. While the families lose their land, I said. While the families lose their land, he said. I looked at the notes on his paper. His handwriting was very even, nothing crossed out, no false starts. The handwriting of someone who had spent a long time translating complicated things into clear language. You did this kind of work for a long time, I said. 8 years. You were good at it. He looked at me steadily. Yes, he said without false modesty and without pride, just the fact. Why did you stop? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the paper. Then he said, I was good at making things clear on paper. I could take a document and find the problem in it and explain the problem in terms a judge could follow, and most of the time the right outcome happened. He paused. But when Annie was dying, I could not do anything useful. All of that skill, all of those years of knowing exactly where the problem was and how to address it. And in the room where it actually mattered, I could not do a single thing. He stopped. The doctor was 3 hours away. I sent for him. He came too late. There was no legal mechanism for what happened. There was no document to read. There was just a woman I loved and a child I would never meet, and nothing in my considerable professional experience that was relevant. He said this very quietly and very steadily, the way people say things they have said to themselves many times in private and have worn smooth with repetition. I looked at him. And so you stopped, I said. And so I stopped, he said, because I could no longer see the point of being skilled at something that had no purchase on the things that mattered. Outside, the morning was doing what Wyoming winter mornings do when they decide to be beautiful, which is to be completely and unreasonably beautiful. The sun hitting the snow at an angle that made everything look like it had been built out of light. Deputy Roy Finn's horse appeared at the top of the trail before I saw Finn himself, the horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. I had known Roy Finn since he came to the territory 6 years ago, a former Union soldier who had come west because he said the East felt too finished, too decided. He was a careful man, deliberate in the way that men are deliberate when they have seen the cost of acting without thinking. He was also a man who knew more than he usually said, which I had always respected about him. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door, and I let him in, and he saw Ridge at the table, and he stopped. There was a moment between the two men, a stillness, a recognition. Not hostile, not warm, exactly. The look of two people who have some understanding of each other from some prior context. Calloway, Finn said. Finn, Ridge said. I looked between them. You know each other. We've crossed paths, Finn said carefully. He took off his hat and came to the table and sat without being asked, which was his habit, and I put coffee in front of him. I heard in town you were up here. I came to tell you something. He said this to Ridge, but then he looked at me. You should hear it too, Mrs. Voss. Dole filed a preliminary notice with Justice of the Peace Harmon this morning. He's claiming the payment default clause in your contract has been triggered, and he's seeking remedy. He paused. Harmon told him he'd need to schedule a formal hearing. Harmon gave him Thursday. Thursday, I said. That's 3 days. Yes. Finn looked at Ridge. Dole knows you're here. I don't know how, but he filed this morning, which is faster than he usually moves, and the timing is not coincidental. Ridge nodded slowly. He wants to file before we can prepare a response. That's my read, Finn said. What do you know about the Creston Shaft claim? Ridge said. The one I filed 18 months ago. Finn was quiet for a moment, his hands around his coffee cup. I know Dole had a connection to the holding company, a quiet one. I know he lost money when the liability claim went through and the operation folded. I know he's not a man who forgets that kind of loss. Can you testify to the connection? Ridge said. I have no documentation. I have what I know from listening carefully in places where people talk freely around lawmen because they think we're not paying attention. Fenn looked at me. I can testify to what I've observed regarding Dole's pattern of land acquisition in this county. I can speak to the timing relative to the railway survey. I can speak to the specific language in the contracts because I've seen enough of them at this point to recognize the phrasing. That helps, Ridge said. Fenn looked at him with the direct look of a man who is about to say something that requires directness. Calloway, you know this puts a target on you. If you help with this hearing and the outcome goes against Dole, he is not going to let that rest. I know it, Ridge said. You're not a resident of this territory. You don't have an office here. You're not a member of any bar. Harmon will hear your presentation as a knowledgeable private individual, not as a legal representative. I know that too. I'm asking, Fenn said carefully, whether you have thought through what you're doing and why you're doing it. The room was quiet. I was looking at Ridge, who was looking at the table, and then he raised his eyes and looked at Fenn, and then he looked at me, and something in the directness of that look made me hold very still. Yes, he said. I've thought through it. Fenn held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the nod of a man satisfied with an answer he can work with. He finished his coffee and stood and put his hat back on. Thursday morning, he said. I'll be there. He went out, and we listened to his horse make its way back down the trail, the hoofbeats fading into the silence of the valley below. And then there was just the two of us, and the fire, and the papers on the table. I was looking at the stopped watch, which was sitting at the edge of the table near Ridge's hand. He followed my eyes. Then, without saying anything, he picked up the watch and turned it over in his palm once and set it back down. Not winding it, just holding it for a moment and setting it back. She would tell me to do this, he said, quietly. I waited. Annie, she would tell me to help with this. She would probably have opinions about exactly how to approach the Harmon hearing, and she would not keep them to herself. A pause. She had opinions about everything. It was one of the things I found difficult sometimes. It is one of the things I miss constantly. I understood this specific grief. The grief not just of losing a person, but of losing the friction of a person, the ways they pushed back, the ways they complicated your thinking, the ways they made you defend your reasoning out loud until you actually knew what your reasoning was. Thomas didn't have opinions so much as he had feelings, I said. He felt very strongly about things. The opinions were harder for him to articulate, but you always knew where he stood because he'd get very quiet, and you'd know the quiet was his opinion. I paused. I've become a person who talks to herself since he died, partly because I don't have anyone to be quiet at. Ridge looked at me with an expression that was the first fully unguarded thing I had seen from him, something that had no performance in it at all. Just a man recognizing the particular shape of a particular loneliness from the inside. Yes, he said. Just that. We worked the rest of the day on the presentation for Justice of the Peace Harmon. Ridge was methodical in a way that I found both reassuring and slightly humbling. He took Hattie's 9 accounts and my contract and Fenn's knowledge of the land acquisition pattern, and he built from them an argument that was clear and sequential and documented at every point. He asked me questions as he worked, not to make conversation, but because my answers gave him information, what Dole had said to Thomas about the contract, what language he had used, what he had explained, and what he had not explained, what Thomas had understood himself to be signing. I answered everything as precisely as I could. Some of it I knew, because Thomas had told me. Some of it I had pieced together after. Some of it I knew because I had read the contract myself after Thomas died, looking for the thing that had put us here, and found the language that Ridge had pointed to the language I had not known how to read. We worked until the light went, and then by lamplight until the lamp needed refilling, and by the end of it, there was a set of documents on my table that represented, as Ridge put it, the best available argument for what had actually been happening in this county for 8 years. Harmon will have to decide what to do with it, Ridge said. I can't predict what he'll decide. But it's a real argument, I said, not just my word against Doles. It's a real argument, he said. Yes. I gathered the papers and ordered them carefully and set them in the chest with the contract. Before I closed the chest, I noticed something on the far corner of the table that had not been there before supper. A small piece of paper folded once set precisely at the edge, as though it had been placed there with intention and then forgotten. I did not open it. It was not mine to open, but the fold was not quite tight, and I could see without meaning to one word written in his clear, careful hand on the inside face of the paper. Just one word. A name. I turned away and went to the kitchen and did not look at it again, but I carried it with me the way you carry things you are not meant to see and cannot put back. Then I turned around, and he was standing by the fire, not looking at me, looking into the flame, and he was holding the watch in his hand again, and his thumb was moving over the stem. The winding stem, back and forth, not pressing it, just touching it. I did not say anything. I went to the kitchen and began to put together what there was for supper, moving quietly. And after a while, I heard a sound from across the room that was very small and very specific. The soft click and catch of a watch being wound. And then faint, in the silence of the cabin, the sound of a watch beginning to run. I kept my hands on what I was doing and did not turn around. But I closed my eyes for just a moment and let the sound of it fill the room, that small, regular ticking, a tiny mechanical heartbeat in the stillness of my father's cabin on the side of a Wyoming mountain, and something in my chest that had been pulled in one direction for a very long time, eased, not all the way, not to where it had been before, but enough. Just enough. When I turned around, Ridge was sitting at the table with the watch in front of him, hands running, and he was looking at it with an expression I did not have words for, but did not need words for. And I set supper on the table between us and sat down across from him, and we ate in the particular quiet of two people who have said enough for one day and know it. The watch ticked on the table between the plates. I did not look at what time it now showed. That felt like his to know, not mine. Outside, the mountain was doing what it does in the deep cold of a Wyoming night, settling into itself, creaking at the joints, breathing slow. Somewhere down the trail was a town with a justice of the peace and a man named Warren Dole, who had had 8 years of patience and was about to run out of it. Thursday was 3 days away. I looked at Ridge across the table, at this man the mountain had sent to my door, in a blizzard, with his stopped watch and his 16 months of counting, and his 8 years of skill and his grief that looked like mine from certain angles, and nothing like mine from others, and I thought about what Hattie had said when she left that afternoon. She had pulled me aside at the door quietly while Ridge was organizing the papers. She had said in the voice she used for the most serious things, "Clara, I have been watching you for 2 years. I know what you look like when you're managing, and I know what you look like when you're living. You have been managing." She had looked at me steadily. "I am not telling you what to do. I am only telling you that you are allowed to stop managing long enough to notice what is in front of you." Then she had gone down the mountain. I thought about that now, across the table from Ridge Calloway and his running watch, and I thought about what was in front of me, and I did not look away from it. I let myself look. And I thought, for the first time in a long time, that looking might be enough to begin with. That beginning might be enough to begin with. Outside, the mountain breathed in the dark, cold, and patient, holding everything it held. And inside, the fire burned down to coals, and the lamp threw its small circle of warmth, and the watch on the table kept its steady count, marking the minutes of a night that felt for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, like something I was moving through rather than enduring. I closed my eyes and let the night be what it was. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat, and I lay still and did not try to name what I was feeling, because some things are better left unnamed until you are certain of them. Wednesday came in cold and clear, and I woke before dawn with the particular alertness of someone whose body has decided that sleep has done what it can, and the rest is up to the person. I lay still for a few minutes in the dark and listened to the cabin. The fire had burned low in the night, the way it always did when I damped it down too much before bed trying to stretch the wood. I could hear the cold in the walls, that specific sound of timber contracting small pops and creaks that I had learned to read the way you learn to read any language you live inside long enough. The mountain was below freezing still. The trail would be hard. I heard nothing from the front room. I had learned by now that his silence was not the silence of absence. He was there. He was simply quiet in the way that he was quiet, gathered into himself, not taking up more space than he needed. I had come to find it a different kind of company than any I had known before this presence, that did not press, that was simply there when you turned toward it. I got up and dressed in the dark and came out and found him sitting at the table with the documents spread before him, going over them by the light of the lamp he had trimmed low to save oil. The watch was open beside the papers. Running. I could hear it from the doorway, that small, steady tick that had become in 3 days one of the sounds of my house. He looked up when I came in. "You should have slept," I said. "I did," he said. "A few hours." I looked at the papers. He had reorganized them again, the 9 accounts from Hattie's book, arranged in chronological order, with notes in his precise hand connecting the common elements, the language in each contract, the timing of each default claim, the proximity of each property to the railway survey line. Beside these, he had placed my contract with specific passages underlined in the light, careful way of someone who does not want to damage a document, just direct attention to it. I built the fire up and put water on and stood at the window while I waited for it to heat. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, that gray before gray, that comes before any color comes, and the mountain was completely still under a hard, clear sky that meant cold but not weather. Good enough for riding. Good enough for the trail into town. Tomorrow was Thursday. I turned from the window and looked at Ridge bent over his papers. And I thought about what the day ahead of us held, and I thought about what Finn had said. "You know this puts a target on you." "Ridge," I said. He looked up. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "All right," he said. "Are you doing this because of Annie?" I said. "Because of what happened to her and the doctor who came too late, and the feeling you had of being skilled at the wrong thing? Are you doing this to prove something to yourself about whether your skills matter?" He looked at me for a long time. The lamp between us threw his face into relief. The plains of it, the tiredness in it, and something else. Something that was considering what I had asked with full seriousness, not dismissing it. "Partly," he said finally. I nodded. I appreciated the honesty more than a clean denial would have satisfied me. "And partly," he said, "because it is the right thing to do. And partly because Dole is doing to you what was done to those 14 families, the same architecture, the same mechanism, the same assumption that no one will understand it well enough to stop it." He paused. "And partly because you asked me." I held his gaze. "I want to make sure," I said carefully, "that when this is over, whatever happens, you have not done something that costs you more than you can afford. You are not a resident here. You have no stake in what happens to this land beyond what you've made of the last 5 days." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." It was the first time he had used my name without Mrs. Voss, and it landed differently than I expected. Just my name in his voice. Nothing added to it. Nothing taken from it. "I have a stake," he said. "I am aware of what it is. Please let me make my own accounting of what I can afford." I looked at him for another moment. Then I went to make the coffee. We worked through the morning, Ridge refining his presentation, and me going over the documents, until I understood them well enough to speak to them myself if Harmon asked me questions directly. Ridge was a careful teacher, which surprised me, and then did not surprise me the patience of it, consistent with everything else about how he worked. He did not simplify things so much that they became false. He explained them fully, and then waited to see what questions I had, and answered those fully too. By mid-morning, I understood exactly what Warren Dole had done, not just in my contract, but across 9 properties over 8 years. I understood the mechanism of it, the way the language was structured to appear protective while functioning as a trap. I understood what common law held about disclosure and fair dealing. I understood what a justice of the peace could and could not decide in a preliminary hearing. Understanding it did not make me less angry. It made me more angry in a cleaner way, the anger that comes from seeing something clearly rather than the anger that comes from feeling something confusedly. I preferred the clear kind. It was more useful. Hattie arrived at midday with bread she had baked that morning and the book which she handed to Ridge with the solemnity of someone transferring something they have been carrying for a long time into hands they trust to carry it correctly. She also brought news. Dole was at the bank this morning, she said, sitting at my table and accepting the coffee I put in front of her. He had a man with him I didn't recognize, dressed well, from out of territory by his coat. Ridge looked up from the papers. A lawyer. Most likely, Hattie said. Ridge looked at the documents in front of him with an expression I was learning to read the inward look of a man recalculating. It doesn't change the argument, he said mostly to himself. It changes the presentation. How so? I said. A lawyer will look for procedural objections, whether I have standing to present, whether the supporting accounts from the book are admissible as evidence rather than hearsay. He'll try to keep the argument narrow, focused only on your specific contract, away from the pattern. He was quiet for a moment. Fenn's testimony becomes more important. He's a sworn officer. His observations about the pattern of acquisition carry different weight. Will Harmon allow it? Hattie said. Harmon has discretion in a preliminary hearing, Ridge said. He can hear what he chooses to hear. If he's a fair man who understands what's being shown to him, he'll hear it. He's a fair man? Hattie said. I've known him 15 years. Then we proceed as planned, Ridge said, and went back to the papers. Hattie looked at me across the table while Ridge worked, and her look said several things at once in the efficient way that Hattie communicated things like, "Are you all right?" and "What is happening between you and that man?" And I have opinions about both of those questions, but I will keep them to myself for the moment. I gave her back a look that said, "I know, and I'm not sure, and please, keep them to yourself a little longer." She gave me a small nod and drank her coffee. In the afternoon, Ridge went out to check on his horse, and I stood at the window watching him cross the yard, and Hattie came to stand beside me. He wound the watch, I said without planning to. Hattie looked at me. It was stopped when he arrived. He wound it last night. Hattie was quiet for a moment. I see, she said in the tone that meant she saw considerably more than what had been said. I don't know what I'm doing, I said. Yes, you do, she said. You're just not certain yet whether you're going to let yourself do it. I looked at her. Clara, I have been a widow for 20 years. I know the arithmetic of it. The way you calculate what you owe the person you lost against what you might take for yourself. The way you add and subtract and come out owing. She put her hand briefly on my arm. I am telling you from 20 years of experience that the arithmetic is wrong. It is a sum that never balances because it was never meant to balance. You can do it for the rest of your life, and the answer will always be the same wrong answer. I looked out at Ridge in the yard, the careful, efficient way he moved a man who had spent 16 months being away from things and was standing now in one place looking at the mountain. He's still grieving, I said. So are you, Hattie said. That doesn't make you unavailable. It makes you the only kind of company that might actually help each other. She went home an hour later, taking the trail down, with the confidence of someone who has made the same journey in worse conditions many times and intends to make it many times more. The afternoon went quiet. Ridge came in, and we ate what there was and sat by the fire. And he went over his notes one more time, and then set them down and looked at the fire. And I looked at the fire, and the watch on the table between us ticked its small, steady count. After a while, he said, I need to tell you something. I waited. When I came here, when I knocked on your door that night, he was looking at the fire, not at me. It was not an accident that I was on this mountain. I had known this, or had suspected it, or had been circling it without looking at it directly. I kept my voice even. Go on. I had been following Dole's activities in this county for 6 weeks, not for any client, on my own. I had heard through someone I knew in Cheyenne that the pattern I had seen in other places was operating here. I came to see it. He paused. I did not know whose land was involved specifically. I did not know about you or Thomas until I read the papers on your table. I looked at the side of his face. The night of the storm, he said. I was coming down from the ridge above your property. I had been up there looking at the land relative to the survey route. The storm came in faster than I anticipated. I came to your door because it was the nearest shelter. So it was partly an accident, I said. The door was an accident, he said. The mountain was not. I sat with this. It was a different thing than I might have felt about it 3 days ago. 3 days ago, before the contract, and Hattie's book, and the Creston shaft, and the watch winding itself in the firelight, I might have felt it as a deception, this man appearing to stumble to my door, who had in fact been circling my property for reasons of his own. Now I felt it as something more complicated and more honest. He had come here with a purpose. The purpose had been real. And somewhere in the collision between his purpose and my door on the night of the storm, something else had happened that was not part of any plan either of us had made. Why are you telling me this now? I said. Because tomorrow we go to Harmon and you will stand up and speak, and everything that happens after that will happen because of what we do in that room. And I did not want you to go into it without knowing the full shape of how I came to be here. He looked at me now. You deserve to know the truth of it, all of it. I looked at him. All right, I said. You're not angry. I'm thinking, I said. There's a difference. He waited. You came here because of Dole, I said. And you knocked on my door because of the storm, and you stayed because of the contract. I paused. And now? Now, he said carefully. I am staying because I want to. The fire shifted in the hearth. The watch ticked. I looked at this man who had arrived in a blizzard with a stopped watch and a truth he had been building toward telling me for 5 days, and I thought about all the ways a person can come to a place, the reasons they give themselves, and the reasons underneath those reasons. And I thought about the fact that he had told me the whole of it when he didn't have to, when the easier thing by far would have been to let me believe the storm was the whole story. I know, I said. He looked at me. I know you want to stay, I said. I've known it for a day at least, maybe longer. I held his gaze. I want you to stay too. I don't know what that means yet, and I think we should go to Harmon's hearing tomorrow before we try to figure it out. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that faces change in stories when the right thing is finally said. Just a settling, a small release of something that had been held. Yes, he said. Tomorrow first. Tomorrow first, I said. We went to bed at different hours, both of us needing the sleep more than we needed to sit in the firelight any longer. And I lay in my room and listened to the cabin and thought about Thursday and what it would bring. And then I stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was not going to make it any different. I thought instead about the watch ticking in the next room. I fell asleep to that sound, and I did not wake until first light, and when I came out, Ridge was already dressed, and the fire was built, and 2 cups of coffee were on the table, and he was standing at the window, looking at the trail. Ready? I said. He turned. Ready, he said. We rode down the mountain into Thursday. The town of Harmon Creek sat at the bottom of the valley in the particular way that territory towns sit, which is to say, practically and without sentiment, a collection of buildings arranged along a main street that existed because the street was where commerce happened, and commerce was what kept people from going somewhere else. It was not a beautiful town. It was a functional town, which in my experience is more reliable than beautiful. The justice of the peace kept his office in a room attached to the back of the hardware store, which had always seemed to me a very honest arrangement. Justice and hardware occupying the same building tools and rulings dispensed from adjacent rooms. Hattie was waiting outside when we arrived, her coat buttoned to the throat, and her expression composed in the way she composed it when she was prepared for difficulty. Finn was there too, in his deputy's coat, standing slightly apart with his arms crossed, and his hat low against the morning cold. And Warren Dole was there. He stood near the door with a man I did not recognize as Hattie had described, well-dressed, an air of professional composure that I recognized as the composure of someone who does this for a living and has learned not to waste energy on nerves. The lawyer. He was younger than I expected. That made him either very good or very confident, and I had learned that in my experience those two things were not always the same. Dole looked at me when I dismounted. Then he looked at Ridge. The look that passed between those two men was not dramatic. It was not the look of enemies in a story with heat in it and old grievance. It was colder than that and more specific, the look of two men who understand exactly what the other is capable of and are calibrating accordingly. Dole said nothing. He went inside. Justice of the Peace. Elias Harmon was 63 years old and had the face of a man who had spent a great deal of time listening to other people explain themselves and had formed careful opinions about the difference between explanation and truth. He sat behind a desk that was too large for the room and had the air of a piece of furniture that had been there longer than the walls around it. He looked at us over his spectacles when we came in. Dole and his lawyer sat on one side. Ridge and I and Finn and Hattie arranged ourselves on the other. The room smelled of wood smoke and paper and cold air from the window that didn't quite close all the way. Harmon said, "I understand we have a matter regarding the Voss property and a contract held by Mr. Dole's bank. I'll hear from both sides and I'll ask my questions when I have them." He looked at Dole's lawyer. "You filed the notice. You'll speak first." The lawyer, whose name was Prewitt, was as efficient as his appearance suggested. He laid out the claim in clean, simple terms. The contract, the payment timeline, the default clause, the triggering of that clause by a payment that had been late by 2 days in November, the remedy sought, which was the right to proceed with foreclosure on the property. He spoke for 8 minutes. He said nothing that was false. He presented the contract as a straightforward agreement between a lender and a borrower, the terms of which had been agreed to and had not been met. When he finished, Harmon looked at our side of the room. Ridge stood. He did not have the lawyer's polished economy. He spoke more slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man who knows that the words are the only tools available and intends to use each one correctly. He introduced himself as a legal clerk and land agent with 8 years of experience in Wyoming Territory property contracts. He stated clearly that he was not representing Mrs. Voss as a lawyer, but speaking as a knowledgeable private individual with relevant expertise, and he asked Harmon's permission to present what he had found. Harmon looked at him for a moment. "Proceed," he said. Ridge began with my contract. He read the default clause aloud, which Prewitt had also read, and then he explained the difference between what it sounded like and what it meant in practice, the way the language worked to appear as standard protection for the lender, while actually removing all protection from the borrower. He spoke about common law principles of fair dealing, about the requirement that a clause of this significance be disclosed and explained at the time of signing, not buried in the middle of a document in language designed to look like every other clause around it. Prewitt objected twice. Harmon heard both objections and overruled them without much deliberation. He was leaning forward slightly over his desk in the posture of a man who is finding what he is hearing interesting, which was the most encouraging thing I had seen since we walked into the room. Then Ridge said, "With the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence that this is not an isolated instance." Prewitt was on his feet. "This hearing concerns the Voss contract specifically. Other matters are not relevant." Harmon held up one hand without looking at Prewitt. He was looking at Ridge. "What evidence?" Ridge set Hattie's book on the desk. "This is a record of 9 families in this county who have had contracts with the same institution containing functionally identical language, 8 years, 9 properties, all of them within the survey corridor for the proposed railway line." Ridge opened the book to the first account. Each instance follows the same pattern. Loan extended in good faith. Repayments made reliably for a period of time. Then a trigger event, always the same clause, always resulting in the same remedy sought. Harmon picked up the book. He began to read. The room was very quiet. Dole across from me had the stillness of a man controlling himself carefully. His lawyer was writing something on a piece of paper. Hattie sat beside me with her hands folded and her face composed. Fen stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. Harmon read for 4 minutes. It felt longer. Then he set the book down and looked at Dole directly over all of us as if the rest of the room had briefly ceased to exist. "Mr. Dole," he said, "are you familiar with these accounts?" Dole's lawyer began to speak. Harmon stopped him with a look. "I asked Mr. Dole," he said. Dole met Harmon's gaze. "Those accounts represent private matters between the bank and individual borrowers. I don't see their relevance." "You don't?" Harmon said, not as a question. "No," Dole said, and in that single word and the composure of it, in the fact that he said it without inflection and without any acknowledgement of what Harmon had just read, something shifted in the room. It was Dole's mistake. The first real one I had seen him make. He had been patient for 8 years because patience was his particular skill, and impatience had not served him, but this was different. This was not impatience. This was the refusal to see what was directly in front of him, which is a different kind of error. The error of a man who has operated successfully for long enough that he has stopped being able to imagine the operation failing. Harmon looked at him for a long moment, with the look of a man who has been listening to explanations for 30 years, and knows the texture of a person who is not giving one. Then he looked at Fen. "Deputy, you've been in this county 6 years?" "Yes, sir," Fen said. "You've observed the pattern of property transactions this man is describing?" "I have," Fen said. "I can speak to 9 specific properties and their proximity to the survey route if it would assist the court." "It would," Harmon said. Prewitt objected. Harmon heard it. He set it aside. Fen spoke for 6 minutes. He named the properties. He named the dates. He named the distance from each property to the nearest surveyed railway section. He spoke in the flat, factual tone of a man who is reporting what he has observed and is aware that observation is different from interpretation and is being careful to offer only the former. When he was done, the room was quiet again. Harmon sat back in his chair and removed his spectacles and held them in his hand and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who has reached a conclusion and is deciding how to articulate it. Then he looked at Dole. "Mr. Dole," he said, "I am not going to rule on the foreclosure today." Prewitt started to speak. Harmon did not stop this time to let him. He continued. "I am placing a stay on any action regarding the Voss property, pending a full review of the contractual language and its application across the cases presented here today. I am also requesting that the Territorial Land Office be notified of this proceeding, and that copies of the relevant contracts be provided to that office for review." He paused. "I would advise you to instruct your client to consider carefully whether he wishes to proceed with this claim in light of what has been presented, or whether a resolution might be reached that does not require the Territorial Land Office to become more closely acquainted with his business practices." He said this last part in the tone of a man who is offering advice that he expects to be understood as something stronger than advice. Dole sat very still. Prewitt leaned toward him and said something quietly. Dole did not look at him. He was looking at the book on Harmon's desk. Then he looked at Hattie, and Hattie looked back at him with the expression of a woman who has been keeping a book for 4 years and is entirely at peace with having done so. Something went out of Dole's face. Not dramatically, just a settling the way a fire settles when the wood has burned through and there is nothing left to feed it. He was not broken. Men like Dole do not break in rooms like this, but he was different than he had been when we walked in. Harmon gathered the papers on his desk. "We're done for today," he said. He looked at me directly. "Mrs. Voss, your property is not at risk pending this review. You'll be notified of any further proceedings." "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, put his spectacles back on, picked up a different paper from a different pile, and began to read it, and we understood that we had been dismissed. We filed out into the cold morning air, and I stood on the street outside the hardware store and breathed for a moment. Hattie came to stand beside me, then Fen, then Ridge. Dole and his lawyer came out a moment later and walked to their horses without looking at us, and rode off down the street at a pace that was controlled and deliberate because Dole was always controlled and deliberate, but in a direction that was away from us, and that was enough. "It's not finished," Ridge said. The review will take time. He may still pursue it. I know, I said. But the stay gives you room to prepare a full response, and once the Territorial Land Office is looking at it, his options narrow considerably. I know, I said again. I looked at the street where Dole had gone. I thought about 8 years and 9 families and a patience that had finally run up against a different kind of patience, the kind that keeps a book and waits. Hattie, I said. She looked at me. Thank you, I said, for the book. She waved her hand in the way she waved her hand at gratitude, dismissing it not because she didn't value it, but because she had never required it. I kept the book because I didn't want to forget, she said. What I did with it today is just the obvious next step. Fen shook Ridge's hand. You presented well, he said. Harmon made it easier, Ridge said. He understood what he was seeing. He's a fair man, Fen said. He looked at me. Mrs. Voss, this isn't the end of Dole, I want to be honest about that. He'll look for other avenues. I know it, I said. But today was today. Fen nodded. He touched the brim of his hat and went to his horse. Hattie embraced me briefly, which was not her custom, and I held on for a moment, because it was mine. Then she stepped back and looked at Ridge and said with the directness that was entirely her own, Young man, you did a good thing today. Don't waste it by leaving. She got on her horse and went down the street to her store, and Ridge and I stood alone on the street in the cold morning air. He looked at me. I looked at him. She's a remarkable woman, he said. She is, I said. She's almost always right about things. He looked at me for another moment. Then he went to untie the horses. We rode back up the mountain. The ride up took longer than the ride down. That is always the way of it going up and coming down, and I had learned not to fight the time, but to use it. I used it now to sit in the saddle and feel the cold air on my face, and let the morning settle into me the way things settle when they are too large to process quickly and need to be given time and motion and the simple work of staying on a horse. Ridge rode beside me and did not speak. This was one of the things I had come to understand about him in 6 days. He knew when words would help and when they would not, and he did not use them in the second case. It was a rarer quality than it sounds. Most people fill silence with language the way they fill empty rooms with furniture, not because the furniture is needed, but because emptiness makes them uneasy. Ridge was not uneasy with emptiness. He could sit in it as comfortably as he sat in everything else, which is to say, without complaint and without performance. Halfway up the mountain, he said without preamble, Tell me about your father. I looked at him. You've told me about Thomas, he said, and you've told me about your mother leaving. But the man who built the cabin and the fences and that woodpile, the man whose way of laying a fire you still use, you haven't talked about him. I thought about this for a moment. He was a quiet man, I said. Not quiet like you. Different. He was quiet because he had decided that most things didn't require comment. He used to say that a person who talks too much is usually just afraid of what they'd hear if they stopped. I paused. He taught me to read land, to understand what the mountain is doing, where the water goes in the spring, where the wind comes from in each season, what the snow can tell you about what's coming. He said, if you learn to read the land, you'll never be completely lost because the land always tells you where you are. He sounds like a man I'd have liked to know, Ridge said. He would have liked you, I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it without qualification. He respected people who did useful things carefully. We rode on. My father was different, Ridge said after a while. He was a man of very strong opinions and very little patience for people who didn't share them. We didn't agree on much. I became a legal clerk partly because I wanted to understand how things worked from the inside, and partly because he thought it was beneath the family, and I was 22, and thought his disapproval was sufficient reason to do anything. He paused. He died while I was working on the Creston claim. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. I'm sorry, I said. I made peace with it, he said. Not with him. That time had passed, but with the fact of it. He looked at the trail ahead. Annie helped with that. She was very clear-eyed about the things you could change and the things you couldn't, and she was not gentle about the difference. "She sounds like Hattie," I said. He thought about this. "A little. Less patient with fools, more willing to laugh at them." I smiled. It surprised me the ease of it, how naturally it came. He looked at me when I smiled, and something in his face changed in the small way his face changed, that barely visible adjustment that I was learning to read. We came up over the last rise, and the cabin was before us. Smoke rising from the chimney, because we had left the fire banked, and the wind had found a way in through the damper the way it always did. And the sight of it in the winter afternoon light, with the snow around it, and the mountain behind it, hit me in the chest with something I did not immediately have a name for. Mine. All of it. Still mine. I had known it was still mine. Harmon had said so. The stay was in place. But knowing a thing intellectually and feeling it in your chest when you see it in the late afternoon light are different operations, and the second one came now complete and physical, like breathing after holding your breath without knowing you were holding it. I stopped my horse at the gate. Ridge stopped beside me. I sat there for a moment and looked at my father's cabin and let myself feel the full weight of what today had meant and what it had nearly been and what it still was. Then I got down and led my horse to the barn. We worked the horses in the easy, companionable silence of two people who have done barn work alongside each other enough times that the work does not require discussion. He took his horse and I took mine, and we went through the routine, brushing and watering and hay, and when we were done, we stood in the warm, dim space of the barn with the horses settling around us and the cold outside pressing against the boards. Ridge said, "I owe you the rest of it." I looked at him. "I told you last night why I came here. I told you about Dole and the survey route." He looked at the straw on the floor. "I didn't tell you that I nearly didn't knock." I waited. "I was at your door for a long time before I knocked. The storm was bad, and I was cold, and I knew there was a light in the window and shelter behind the door. But I stood there." He paused. "I've been spending 16 months making sure not to be in anyone's way. Not to cost anyone anything. Moving on before I became a burden. It's become a habit. A comfortable one." "What made you knock?" I said. He looked at his horse, who was pulling contentedly at the hay. "The horse," he said. "She needed to come in out of the cold, and she couldn't knock for herself, so I knocked for her." I looked at him. "And then you opened the door," he said. "And after that, the rest of it followed from there." I thought about standing in my doorway with my rifle and a stranger's eyes telling me something that I had recognized without being able to name. The eyes of a man who had stopped wanting things. He was wanting things now. I could see it. It was a careful wanting, tentative, the wanting of someone who has been without it long enough to have become cautious of it, but it was there. I knew something about that caution. We went inside. I built the fire up and put water on and moved around my kitchen in the familiar way. And Ridge sat at the table with the documents he had gathered from the hearing and went through them methodically, sorting what needed to be kept and what could be set aside, bringing the same careful attention to the end of the work that he had brought to the beginning of it. The watch was on the table, running. After supper, we sat by the fire, and for a long time, neither of us spoke, and the silence had the quality of the first silence I had noticed between us, the one in the barn the morning after he arrived, but different now, full in a different way, with the specific weight of two people who have been through something together and are sitting in the aftermath of it. Ridge said, "I want to tell you something about Annie." I looked at him. "I have not spoken about her," he said, "since she died. Not to anyone. I have said the facts of it when necessary. She died. The child died. It was 16 months ago, but I have not spoken about her." He looked at the fire. She would find that very annoying. She believed in saying things out loud. She said that thoughts you keep inside go sour like milk in summer. I waited. "She was 28 years old," he said. "She had red hair that she could not do anything reasonable with, and it made her furious. She could not carry a tune, but she sang constantly regardless. She had a way of asking questions that made you say true things when you had intended to say easier things." He paused. "She was the most honest person I have ever known, including with herself, which is the harder kind of honesty. She didn't soften things. She didn't make things worse than they were either. She just saw them as they were and said what she saw. The fire moved. The watch ticked. She told me once early on, when we were still learning each other, she told me that I held things too tightly. Everything. She said, "Calloway, you grip everything so hard you leave marks in it." She meant the work and the worry and the plans. She spent 8 years slowly convincing me that you could set things down sometimes without losing them. He stopped. And then she was gone, and I picked everything back up and held it tighter than I ever had, because holding it tightly felt like the only way to keep her present. I looked at him. "The watch?" I said. "The watch," he said. "Yes." I thought about what it had meant for him to wind it, the small mechanical action of pressing the stem and feeling the resistance and turning it anyway. Setting the thing in motion again. "She would approve of you," he said. "She would have approximately 40 opinions about the situation, and none of them would be comfortable, and she would not keep any of them to herself, and she would be right about most of them." "That sounds familiar," I said. He looked at me with a question in it. "Thomas," I said. He would have found this all very straightforward. He would have told me to stop thinking so carefully and just decide. He was better than me at decisions. He was worse than me at reading the fine print, and that balance worked for us most of the time. "Most of the time," Ridge said. "Yes," I said, "except at the end." We sat with that, not painfully, just honestly. "I have something I want to show you," Ridge said. He reached into his coat, which was hung over the back of the chair beside him, and he brought out a small piece of paper folded twice. He unfolded it carefully and set it on the table between us. On the paper in his clear hand was written a single name. Samuel. I looked at it. "That was what we were going to call him," Ridge said. "We had decided before he was born. Annie chose it. She said it was a name that would hold a person up." He looked at the paper. "He never had a day. He never had anything except that name, and 16 months of me carrying it around on a piece of paper I couldn't put down." I looked at the name on the paper, and I thought about all the things that do not get to happen, all the lives that are planned for and prepared for, and then do not arrive. And I thought about Thomas, who would never fix another fence or hum his wordless song. And I thought about my father, who had built everything I lived inside with his hands and his years. And I thought about all the weight that a person carries without choosing to carry it, that simply attaches itself in the ordinary course of living and loving and losing. "There's a corner of the garden," I said, "on the south side, where the ground is soft in the spring and the sun gets there first. My father planted bulbs there when my mother left. He didn't explain why. He just planted them and they came up every spring." Ridge looked at me. "If you wanted," I said carefully, "a place to put it, so it doesn't have to be on a piece of paper in your pocket." He was very still. "You don't have to," I said. "It was only a thought." "No," he said. "I want to." In the morning, before the light came, I heard him outside. I lay in my room and listened to the sounds of him working in the garden. The careful sounds of a man doing something that matters, and I did not go out because some things need to be done without witness, but I lay there and listened until the sounds stopped. And then I heard him come back inside, and I heard him sit at the table, and I heard the watch ticking in the silence. I got up. He was at the table with his hands around his coffee cup and his coat still on, and there was mud on his boots from the garden soil, and his face had the look of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. Not lighter exactly, but different. The way you look when the weight you're carrying stops being something you're fighting and becomes something you know how to hold. I poured my own coffee and sat across from him. The watch was on the table between us, running. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," I said. "It's just ground." He looked at me. "It's good ground," he said. I thought about my father planting bulbs in that corner after my mother left. I had never understood until this moment what he was doing. He was giving the thing that hurt a place to be, not burying it, planting it, so it could come up in the spring. "Ridge," I said. He looked at me. Finn said this county needs someone who knows land law. He did, Ridge said carefully. And Hattie told you not to waste what you did yesterday by leaving. She did. I looked at my coffee cup, then at him. I am not a person who says things I don't mean, and I am not going to start now. I don't know what the next part of this looks like. I know it's too soon to know, and I know we're both still carrying things, and I know that neither of us is the same person we were before the people we loved died. I paused. But I don't want you to leave because it's the easier thing. I want you to stay because you want to stay. And if you want to stay, there is room here, not just in the barn. He sat across from me and looked at me for a long time, and I let him look because I had said what was true, and I was not going to unsay it, and I was not going to make it smaller to make it easier for either of us. The Creston Shaft case, he said. I need to finish the documentation for the Territorial Land Office review. It will take a few weeks of work. All right, I said. Finn mentioned there are 2 other properties in the county with similar contracts. He's been waiting for someone who could help the families understand what they signed. That sounds like work that needs doing, I said. It does, he said. There's a table in this room, I said, and a fire, and a window that gets the morning light. He looked at the window. The morning light was just beginning to come through it, that first pale gray that was about to become gold. The north fence, he said. I want to reinforce the 2 corner posts before the next hard freeze. The deadmen I set are good, but the posts themselves are older than they should be. I noticed that last spring, I said. I kept meaning to get to it. I'll get to it today, he said. If you'll tell me where your father kept the spare posts. South side of the barn, I said. Back corner standing upright. He nodded. He got up and took his coat from the chair and put it on. He picked up the watch and turned it once in his hand and set it in his pocket, closed running, and he went to the door. Then he stopped. Clara, he said. I looked at him. I don't know how to do this, he said. I haven't known how to do anything properly in 16 months. I know how to work, and I know how to read a contract, and I know how to be useful. Beyond that, I'm not certain. I haven't known how to do this for 2 years, I said. I only know how to manage things. That's different from doing them. He looked at me for a moment. We could learn, he said. We could try, I said. That's probably the same thing. He went out to the barn. I sat at my table with my coffee and the watch gone from its place on the table. But the watch's absence different from the absence of the stopped watch, different in the way that a room is different when someone has gone out and will be back, rather than when someone has simply gone. I thought about what Hattie had said. You are allowed to stop managing long enough to notice what is in front of you. I thought about my father planting bulbs in the south corner of the garden. I thought about Thomas's wordless song, the few bars of it, the way it had haunted the feed store, and the way I had turned before I could stop myself. And I thought about the sound that had come through the wall on that first night Ridge talking quietly to someone who couldn't answer, and how I had lain still and let him have it, and how that might have been the first true thing we did for each other, long before either of us knew we were doing anything at all. Outside, I could hear him in the barn, moving with the unhurried purpose that was simply his way of being in the world. The sound of the barn door. The sound of posts being moved. The sound of a man beginning a piece of work that he intended to finish. I got up and started the bread. Spring came late that year. March held cold. April held colder, and the snow stayed on the high ridges long past when it should have given way. But when it came all at once, the way Wyoming springs always come, not gradually, but completely, the mountain going from white to itself in the space of a week. Ridge had been living in the cabin since January. He had built a second room onto the east side of the house in February Sound and Square with a window facing the mountain large enough to see the whole East Ridge from a desk. He had a desk now. There was work enough in the county for a man who knew land law, and Ridge did it carefully the same way he did everything. Warren Dole had been seen. That was the outcome. Not arrested, not ruined, but seen, and the space in which men like Dole operate had become considerably smaller. It was not everything. It was not nothing. For the families in Hattie's book, it was a beginning, and beginnings were what the county needed most. In the south corner of the garden, the bulbs my father planted years ago came up as they always did, yellow and white. Beside them, smaller and newer, something blue came up that I did not plant. Ridge had put them in during November, pressing bulbs into frozen ground on a morning I did not know about until I saw what came of it. I asked him what they were. He said Annie had liked blue flowers. He thought the corner needed some. I looked at the yellow and white and blue together in the April light, and I thought about my father pressing bulbs into the ground the autumn my mother left without explaining why, and I thought I understood now what he had been doing. Not burying something, planting it, giving it a place to come back from. In the south corner of my garden, where the ground came soft and sunny in the spring, the bulbs my father had planted came up as they always did, yellow and white, and beside them, something new had come up too, not planted by my father, smaller flowers that Ridge had put in November in the cold ground blue ones, a kind I didn't recognize. I had asked him about them. He said Annie had liked blue flowers. He had thought the corner needed some. On a morning in April, when the snow was finally off the lower slopes and the mountain was beginning to smell like itself again, like pine and cold water, and something underneath that was purely altitude. I came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and found Ridge standing at the fence line looking at the new post he had set on the northwest corner. He had reset all the corner posts over the winter, working on the clear days. The fence line was straight and tight in a way it had not been in years. I handed him the coffee and stood beside him. We stood looking at the fence and the mountain behind it and the valley below and the town just visible at the far end, small and certain. "The Harpers are going to need help with their spring planting contract," he said. "Old Silas can't read, and his son doesn't understand what the feed merchant is asking him to sign." "When?" I said. "Thursday," he said. "Finn's going to ride out with me." "All right," I said. We stood in the morning light and drank our coffee, and the mountain was doing what it does in the spring, waking up from itself, making all the sounds of ice melting and water moving and things returning that had been gone. The watch was in Ridge's pocket, running. It had been running since December. I had stopped thinking about what time it showed. It was a watch now, not a monument. It kept time the way a watch is supposed to keep time, without drama, without weight, simply counting the minutes as they came. After a while, he said, "I have a question." "All right," I said. He turned and looked at me with the directness that was his particular quality, the thing I had seen in the doorway on the night of the storm, and recognized without knowing what I was recognizing. "I want to put our name on the gate," he said, "the way it should be, if you're willing." I looked at him. "Not because of what it means legally," he said. "I know what it means legally. I mean what it means." He paused. "What it would mean to you." I thought about Thomas. I thought about him in the way I had learned to think about him, which was not with the blind grief of the first year or the managed grief of the second, but with something that was simply love, clear and specific. The love you have for someone who was real and was yours and is gone and will always have been both of those things. I thought about what Thomas would say, the man who had strong feelings about things and expressed them in quietness. I thought he would be quiet in the way that meant yes. "What name?" I said. Ridge looked at me. "Whatever name you want it to be," he said. "That's your decision. I'm just asking to be on it." I looked at the gate. The old board was weathered and splitting. It had my father's writing on it, faded now to almost nothing, just the ghost of letters. "There's good pine board in the barn," I said. "Second stack from the left." He looked at me. "The lettering should be large enough to read from the road," I said. "My father always said a gate sign that you can't read is worse than no sign at all." Something happened in his face, not a large thing, the small thing that his face did when something mattered, that barely visible shift that I had learned to see and that I now understood, was the most honest expression he had. "I'll get the board," he said. He went to the barn. I stood at the gate in the April morning with my coffee going cold in my hands and the mountain warm against my back and the valley spread below me, and I thought about all the things that had come to my door and all the things that had gone and all the things that had stayed. The board went up that afternoon. 2 names. Clear enough to read from the road. The next morning, I came out and he was already at the table with the Harper contract spread out before him, the lamp trimmed, and his coffee cooling at his elbow, and his head bent over the work with that complete attention that was simply how he existed when he was doing something that mattered. The watch was on the table beside the contract, running. I put fresh coffee in front of him without being asked. He looked up, and the morning light came through the east window at the angle it came through in April, that specific April light, and it fell across the table and the papers and the watch and his face, and I stood there for a moment, and I thought about my father, who had read the land, and my mother, who had left, and Thomas, who had trusted too easily, and Annie, who had laughed at everything, and all of the specific complicated true things that had made us the particular people who had arrived at this particular table in this particular spring. I thought that my father, who had said the land always tells you where you are, would have approved of the reading of it that had brought us here. I sat down. We had work to do, and for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, the work was not the whole of the day. It was just the beginning of it. Outside, the mountain went on being itself vast and patient and entirely indifferent to the small human arrangements made in its shadow, and entirely silently present for all of them. The gate at the bottom of the property bore 2 names now in letters large enough to read from the road. The bulbs in the south corner were fully open yellow and white and blue against the new spring ground. And inside the cabin that my father built, the watch on the table kept its steady count, marking the minutes of a morning that felt completely and without qualification, like the first morning of something rather than the continuation of something else. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.